thank you for coming. This is the first of our winter quarter lecture series. We could not hope to open our series with a better talk and a greater speaker. We opened our series in the fall quarter with Timothy Verdon talking about another exhibit he curated, and it was an excellent quarter, both in terms of the general tenor of the quarter, but also in terms of our Incontri a Palazzo. So I'm very pleased you accepted my invitation to come address our students and our guests tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about Timothy Verdon, whom many of you know very well. He's Monsignor, a Roman Catholic priest. He's a canon of the Florence Cathedral and also the director of the Mount Tabor Ecumenical Center for Art and Spirituality at Barga. He is a Yale-trained art historian. He's the director of the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo here in Florence and the author of its new installation project. He's also the director of the Office of Cultural Heritage of the Archdiocese of Florence, and also, and most importantly, if you ask me, the professor of art history here at Stanford University. His teaching of art history is actually endowed by the Berg family of San Francisco. So Professor Verdon is a very busy man. He's also a very prolific writer. I will not discuss or list all of his books, but it will suffice to say that his most recent books include a 4-volume study of the biblical sources of the Sistine Chapel frescoes, and this is coming out this year from the Vatican Museum Press. But he's also publishing another book this year together with the Sole 24 Ore, in its Grandi Libri series, which, for those of you who know, it's a very, very prestigious and also beautiful publication. And this one in particular is on Fra Angelico. In addition to all this, Timothy Verdon keeps himself very busy, also as curator of a variety of different exhibits. Over the summer, when most of us were vacationing, I kept seeing Timothy Verdon's pictures from South Korea, from Seoul, because he had curated a wonderful exhibit there, which the government there opened to welcome Pope Francis to Seoul. Then the fall quarter came, and I started reading about Timothy Verdon on either the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, because he curated an exhibit which is still going on in Washington, D.C., and it is also the reason why we have a Pontormo painting missing from the chapel, the Capone Chapel here, together with a stained glass window. And this is an exhibit which is at the Museum for Women's Art in Washington, D.C. Friends in Washington. Stanford University has a program in D.C., Stanford in Washington, and I hear from the people at that program and others in D.C. that the exhibit is very much talked about, and the exhibit is extraordinarily successful. You can read, as I say, about it on the newspapers, as well as hear Timothy Verdon speak about it on NPR. There's a great interview there. Now, tonight, Timothy Verdon is here to discuss the more recent exhibit, which is just curated. This one is opening in New York. It's Donatello going to New York. And it is the New York Times, among other newspapers, discussing it in very, very high, extraordinary terms. And now, so the title of the talk tonight is Donatello in Manhattan, Masterpieces of the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo at the Museum of Biblical Art. So, which is a very small museum, and the New York Times in the article says it's a great coup for that museum. Everybody talks about it now that Timothy Verdon is bringing over all kinds of wonderful masterpieces. So thank you again. It's amazing that you could find the time to be here tonight with us. So we appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
Linda, thank you very much. What you say about my being busy is certainly true, but it's a pleasure to be able to come and talk about the New York exhibit in proximity to its opening. It will open on February 20th. I'm going to use the occasion to talk about a number of other things that I think are useful to understand the New York exhibit, but also fit very much into the overall picture of what I, with others, are doing right now. And in fact, I open the lecture with a work that is not Donatello and that is not going to New York. Many of you will recognize it as one of the panels from Luca della Robbia's Cantoria, the organ loft singing gallery that he made to be positioned in the cathedral opposite a similar structure by Donatello. All of this in the 1430s. This is one of the great masterpieces of our museum, the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, and it is a work that has never traveled. There are 10 of these panels. They have never traveled. They've always been in the museum in an arrangement that I'll show you a bit further on in the talk. These are now en route from Atlanta to Detroit. So despite the very full introduction that Linda gave, she did not mention yet another exhibit, which is not mine, and so she was quite right in not mentioning it, but which is an exhibit of works from the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo. So I'm involved in the sense that I had to approve the loan. It's an exhibit organized by an old friend, Gary Radke, for the High Museum in Atlanta. Its real focus is Renaissance music, but the most important works in the exhibit are 3 of the 10 Luca della Robbia panels from the Cantoria. And in fact, at the end of the week in New York, in which I'm there with others to open the show about which I'll be speaking presently, I'll fly out to Detroit to give a lecture on our collection and the works that they will then have. I think the Detroit opening is in 10 days or 2 weeks. I forget the exact date. That means that at that particular point, we'll actually have a very considerable part of our collection on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So not only does Donatello go to New York, but Luca della Robbia, who's already been in Atlanta, is now winging his way west to Detroit. Before actually approaching the material that I promised to talk about this evening, for those who may not know this, and that would include my own students freshly arrived, and perhaps some of the adult public, we are able to send all of these things. We're able to send all of these things to the States because our museum, which is located directly behind the cathedral, is presently closed. Has been closed now for about a year, is expected to open on the 29th of October of 2015. But in that lapse of time, obviously we are free to have our works travel. That is indeed in our interest in terms of strategy, of public relations. We want the collection to be known. We do not want to simply disappear from the screen in this rather long period of closure, in part because up to the present, the museum that you see outlined in orange there, while not really small, neither was very large, and so fit into a category of medium-scale museums. That now is about to change because we reacquired several years ago the very large building just above the existing museum. The existing museum was opened in 1891 in premises that had belonged to the Cathedral Foundation since the end of the 13th century, that had really been the warehouses and workyards where the materiel was stored. Much of the marble was carved, where the bricks for the dome were baked, and so on. This was the work site behind the cathedral, and originally it included this building and actually everything that's in front of it and a good deal that's behind it as well. But in 1778, I was very young then, the Cathedral Foundation sold more than half of this enormous property right in the center of the city, right behind the cathedral, because the cathedral was well and truly built. There was no longer a need for this kind of staging area. And they sold it to people who wanted to construct a theater, the building whose roof you see with 19th century skylights in it, there above the orange outline, was constructed in the late 1770s to be one of Florence's larger theaters. It was called the Teatro degli Intrepidi. It ceased being that in the mid-19th century. It descended several rungs in the social architectural ladder. In its last incarnation, it was the Center City Garage. We were able to buy it in the 1990s. And we wanted to buy it because since it is contiguous with the existing museum, and indeed was originally part of the same complex of buildings, the idea for a long time had been to enlarge the museum. Buying the former theater, we were able to contemplate doing that. The board of directors, of which I was then a member, asked me to prepare an installation project, and that's what we're presently realizing, that's what we're presently doing. And so the old museum is closed because it's being completely restyled, and the collection, which did not have hundreds of works in the warehouses, it's the same collection that was in the small old museum, is being disposed in an entirely new way. And while all of that work is going on, we have several hundred works, of which at least 50 or 60 major masterpieces, to send around the world. So when a group of Koreans came to me at the end of April and said, we want to do an exhibit for the Pope's visit, and I said, marvelous, when is the Pope's visit? And they said, in August. And I said, you mean August of this year? And they said, yes. And I said, you can't do an exhibit in 3 months. And then reflecting a bit on the fact that it was in our interest to let the collection be seen, I in fact sent some 70 works to Seoul, from which some have already returned, and the last ones are coming back now. I wanted, though, to give you a sense of how this becomes possible. There is the space under that big roof with its skylights as it looked when we bought it. That is the space that I was asked by the board of directors to go and look at and then decide how to use together with the existing museum. When I saw this space, I immediately understood that it offered a unique possibility, which I'll try to explain. It's a very big space. Obviously, there's nothing left of the 18th century theater. The building has been well and truly and happily gutted. If there still were the 5 tiers of late Baroque boxes and the painted ceiling and the stage and so on, the arts authorities would not let us modify those, so we would not have built the structure if it had not been free of those glorious impedimenta. It's enormous, though. It's about 100 feet long on the long walls and about 40-some feet wide. And when I walked in, I understood that we could do something that I had been dreaming of for a long time. An important part of our collection is sculpture from the original facade of the cathedral. Students in my class heard me say this morning that the facade you see today is a 19th century one, and many people who live in Florence know that. Many forget that a facade was begun when the cathedral was begun. In 1296, the architect of the cathedral, Arnolfo di Cambio, also a very famous sculptor, indeed today better remembered as a sculptor, was hired basically because he could not only build but also decorate the new church. Florence wanted a building richly adorned with sculpture, as the northern European cathedrals were, and as only one other church in Italy then was, which was the Cathedral of Siena, which explains why the Florentines wanted their church to be more richly decorated with sculpture. It was part of a centuries-long rivalry between the two neighboring city-states. Here is a drawing made of the lower part of the facade, showing the height to which the marble revetment and the very rich sculptural program reached. It never went much above the doors, and so the whole upper part remained unfinished, which is why in 1587 Grand Duke Francis I decided that it should be removed. No one in the late 16th century wanted to complete a Gothic facade. They found the 14th and even early 15th sculpture awkward, and so they removed it. But before doing so, they created the drawing, part of which you see reproduced here on the screen. And it is that precious document of what the old facade looked like in its incomplete form that I had in mind when I looked at the long wall of the garage, on which I envisioned what is now being built, a reconstruction of what had been done of the medieval facade as the only possible setting for the 60-some works of sculpture that we have from that facade. To simply put them on pedestals around the walls of a room, as they were exhibited in the old museum, does not allow those works to say what they were meant to say, gives no notion of the innovative, indeed revolutionary quality of the entire project and of the works of sculpture themselves. So in the very large space that we have at our disposal, even as I speak, because they've knocked off at this point of the day, but certainly every day in this period we have some scores of workmen realizing all of this. The entire long wall will reproduce almost everything that we have in that 16th century drawing. So the entire facade will look something like this, and this architect's rendering allows you to understand something about how the sculpture will be arranged. We are really going to put it back in its original position. In some cases, the original works will actually be more at museum level, and above them in the true position there will be casts, because very important works need to be seen up closer. But the overall intention is to allow viewers to understand what the works of sculpture were meant to look like, did look like really, until 1587. The works were positioned in the niches that you see here from the beginning of the project, really underway in the early 1300s, to the time of its dismantling in 1587. All of this is to help you understand the interest of what we're doing, and also why it was important to us to bring some of the works that will be situated in this context to New York. One of the best known works situated in this context is one of the 4 statues in those large niches to right and left of the main door in our reconstructed facade. They were late additions to this church front, begun, we said, in 1296. They were carved in the early 1400s for my own students. They would normally be a fundamental page in the lecture that I gave today. They were not. I had to keep telling the students that these works that I'm mentioning are in the museum, which is closed. So I'm delighted to be able to show those who may be present this evening a few of these. The most famous of these 4 statues done in the early 1400s is a seated St. John the Evangelist. The statues represent the 4 evangelists. And so one of them is St. John, the mystical evangelist, carved by Donatello, begun in 1408, and then apparently he lagged and returned to it and doesn't actually consign it to the cathedral authorities until 1415. It's a work that has always been photographed as you see it here, and the way in which it has been presented really has left people saying, well, why is this an important work? It may have the documented authorship of Donatello, but it seems deformed. It's an ugly-looking work. It has none of the qualities that we associate with this great 15th century sculptor's later works. And so it's a work that had never really been understood because it was photographed as it was seen in our old museum at eye level. And so I'm going to take it back and put it basically about 3 meters above the level of the pavement in the museum. The visitor will see it at exactly the level for which it was carved, and at that level it doesn't look like this, but like this. And that simply to give you a sense of why we're doing this. We're talking in every case about absolutely site-specific art, works made for that facade, and in most cases very specifically for that niche on that facade. Therefore, by sculptors who understood exactly how the work would be seen and who carved it. In the case of Donatello, we know his extraordinary interest, almost obsession with the optical effects of his works. If you read Vasari's Life of Donatello, that's one of the great themes. And so to be able to put the work back at its intended level of view really restores to it the drama that the work has, and which has usually simply not been seen. One of the few people who did see it many years ago was my principal teacher at Yale, my Doktorvater, as the Germans say, thesis director, dissertation director, Charles Seymour Jr., who had begun his career as director of the Department of Sculpture at the National Gallery in Washington, and then came back to Yale, where he had been an undergraduate, to teach. And in a book that my students will find here in the library, his Penguin series volume on Italian sculpture 1400 to 1500, he published a photograph to take which he must have gotten down on his back on the pavement in the museum to get the angle of view, as indeed this photograph was made in the warehouse where the work is now stored, and so the photographer had to play those kinds of tricks in order to create the angle of view. But when seen as Seymour understood it should be seen, and it was one of many things in his teaching that deeply impressed me, because it told the truth about these works, that they're meant to be seen in their intended situation. When seen as he illustrated it was meant to be seen, and as we will now make it visible to all who come to the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, it very clearly is the immediate source of another later work, a work carved a century later by an artist that we can consider a follower of Donatello, a little-known Florentine called Michelangelo Buonarroti. His Moses in San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, carved in the 15 teens, really is inspired by the statue that he, like other Florentines, would have seen every day when he passed in front of the cathedral, in that niche immediately to the viewer's right of the main door, the St. John the Evangelist. And that is one of the statues that we're sending to New York. I would have liked to send the Moses as well, but in Rome they were not enthusiastic about that, and so I'm joking, obviously there was no plan to send the Moses, which is irremovable. But for those who know the Michelangelo work, to see the Donatello St. John the Evangelist, as it will be exhibited in the exhibit in New York, on a very high plinth, therefore obliging the viewer to look up at it, leaving no possibility of the kind of entirely frontal view that the work had for many decades in our old museum arrangement. That will be a coming attraction of what the new museum is about. Indeed, within the context of the exhibit at the Museum of Biblical Art in New York, we will be showing a film about the new museum. Our real interest in all of this is also to create curiosity for the new museum, which, since it's costing us many millions of euros, really has to have an unending line of paying visitors. And so we have to create an interest which I'm sure will be fully satisfied by those who come to the museum. We were extremely happy to have the opportunity to work with this small, non-collecting museum, the Museum of Biblical Art, which was born, I think, about 20 years ago as a gallery extension of the American Bible Association. And so it's born in the context of American Protestant Bible studies and the publishing of the Bible, but which in 2005 broke away from the American Bible Association context and while maintaining its commitment to exhibit art that is inspired in some way by the Judeo-Christian scriptures, positioned itself as an autonomous museum using the biblical sources not, as they had previously been used, as a confessional expression, but simply as one of the great cultural sources of Western art. Nonetheless, the commitment of MOBIA, as it is called, Museum of Biblical Art, to the biblical subject matter was essential for us, because to try, as scholars have done since art history became a university discipline, to talk about these extremely important and influential works simply as passages in the development of style, without pausing to deeply consider their meaning in their original context, is to misunderstand the works, is to misunderstand the spirit in which they were commissioned and the spirit in which arguably they were carved. Of course, they are also extremely important steps in the unfolding stylistic history of the Renaissance. They are indeed the works that define what scholarship in the 19th and 20th century called the early Renaissance. But they cannot be completely separated from their context, and that is a context of Judeo-Christian meaning. And so the Museum of Biblical Art gave us the opportunity to talk about the works in light of their true original sense. For example, here in the catalog, I talk about, and others writing essays in the catalog talk about, the fact that Donatello, for his St. John the Evangelist, chooses the bearded, aged figure of the evangelist, not the youthful, beloved disciple, because the tradition of Christian iconography had, for centuries, envisioned John as the old evangelist, exiled to the island of Patmos, who at the end of his life is believed to have written the book of Revelation, as well as his gospel and the letters, three letters that bear his name, the Apocalypse or book of Revelation. The way Donatello interprets the figure has a visionary dimension that really corresponds exactly to the personage who comes through the pages of that last of the biblical books ascribed to him, the Apocalypse or book of Revelation. We will send with the Donatello the extremely beautiful statue that was the pendant piece. The Donatello seated John the Evangelist was in the niche to the viewer's right of the main door. To the viewer's left of the same door, a seated evangelist on the same scale, Nanni di Banco's figure of St. Luke, balanced the Donatello St. John, and the other two evangelists, Matthew and Mark, were in the outer niches. The two sculptors almost certainly compared notes, understood that one called to do the work that those entering the cathedral will see at their right, and the other to see the work at their left. They seem to have agreed that their statues should appear to interact with the public. And so Donatello's St. John, seated frontally, actually begins to turn, his head begins to turn, as if he adverts to the presence of those who are entering through a door which would be, as you look at it, at your left of him. And so there's this incipient movement of his head as if he is about to turn and look at those who will enter the cathedral. On the other side, Nanni di Banco's St. Luke turns to look to his left, which is the viewer's right. The two works were genuinely complementary, and where Donatello gave us the visionary St. John, Nanni di Banco, in this superb statue, really an unsung masterpiece. Nanni is well known, but this particular work, for the same reason that I've mentioned with regard to the Donatello statue, was never adequately studied. Nanni di Banco, doing St. Luke, gives us the wonderfully sensitive face of an intellectual, of a scholar. Luke is the only one of the evangelists who in the opening pages of his gospel tells us what his scholarly method was. He says, there are many accounts already published of the life of Jesus. I have read them all. I have compared these things, and I'm trying now to write a more orderly account. And so, of the four Gospels, Luke's is the one clearly written by someone with the attributes of a scholar, and the sensitive and intellectual look that Nanni gives to this extraordinarily beautiful head really are part of that process of interpretation which becomes legible in the original context of the works. We're also sending to New York pieces of the extremely important final side door that I looked at on site with my students this morning, the Porta della Mandorla, which is the northeastern door of the cathedral. There's the whole door. It was recently cleaned, and so it is today visible in something like its original splendor. And in the carved lower parts of the door, the upper section, the gable relief done by Nanni di Banco, in the lower parts of the door, Nanni and other young sculptors, including Donatello, in the very early 1400s, did the sculpture of the archivolt, that's to say the richly decorated, oops, sorry, where was I going there? There, the richly decorated lower arch. I showed my students this morning part of the vertical supports of the lower part of the door done into the 1390s for them here in a piece that we're sending to New York, which is part of the upper curve of the door, which is today attributed to Nanni di Banco. You see him certainly imitating that very classical nude figure, that Hercules figure that I showed you in that incredibly precocious reclaiming of classical sculpture there in the lower part of the door before even the beginning of the 15th century. The young Nanni di Banco in the early 1400s carves this piece of the upper archivolt where again you have that kind of Hercules figure. These are the first steps toward that recovery of classical sculpture that is the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. And we'll be talking about the entire door and publishing diagrams to help the viewers of the exhibit see exactly where that and another piece from the door that we're sending actually sat. We're also sending two statues that originally stood on those vertical plinths that you see in the upper part of the Porta della Mandorla. I did not bring them this evening. They really are something for scholars, but to give you an idea of the kinds of things we're showing in New York, I wanted to at least illustrate the position of the so-called profetini, the little prophets. One carved by Donatello, one carved by Nanni di Banco, arguably when both artists were still very young. Part of what we're doing in New York, part of what we do in the museum, is to illustrate in positioning the works the drama of what was not only meaningful biblical subject matter, but also existential rivalry between and among artists. So much of this work is being done at the same time in a very concentrated arc or span of years. that it becomes clear as you look at the works that artists were competing between and among themselves, not least because that was how you got the next commission. Indeed, those four evangelists that I showed you in the diagram, and then we looked at two of them, were originally given as three commissions. Three artists were called, each was assigned an evangelist. Donatello and Nanni were among the first three. Niccolo Lamberti was the third sculptor, and they were told, whoever of you does the most interesting evangelist will get the commission for the fourth one, which would be Saint Matthew. And then the foundation lost patience with the many years it was taking them to do these, and so gave the fourth evangelist to another artist quite apart from its agreement. This is something I shouldn't tell Americans, but in Italy you need to be very wary of contracts. They usually include a clause, or a clause will later be invented that allows the contracting party out of whatever he has committed to do. That's a naughty thing that I shouldn't have said. I will claim I wasn't here this evening, or if I was asleep. So there. I wanted to show you the overall Porta della Mandola, because in the upper part of that richly carved tympanum, which is on the cathedral, which we can't send to New York, you can see above the mandorla, that is to say almond-shaped glory surrounding Mary being assumed into heaven, a number of small angels playing musical instruments, and most scholars of Renaissance sculpture today agree that this may be where one of the most important sculptors of the next generation, the generation that emerges in the 1430s, differently from Nanni and Donatello, who emerged in the very first years of the century, where another important Renaissance sculptor comes from. He is the same Luca della Robbia that I showed you in the very first image that we looked at. Here is the extremely important work that he was commissioned to create in 1431, one of the two organ lofts for the interior of the cathedral, a very major commission because, as I said, it contains these 10 important reliefs of music-making children, and it contains them in an extremely modern, which for that period is to say classical, Roman-looking architectural partie, a kind of micro-architecture, which is the actual structure of the singing gallery and organ loft. From above the marble railing would have risen the pipes of the organ, which we still have, actually. We don't have the wooden facing, and so there's no possibility of reconstructing that, but that's simply to remind you what the function was. As I said, there are a number of reliefs from the cantoria in the United States. They will not be in New York. I would have wanted to send, we have 10, there are only 3 in this other exhibit. I would have liked to send at least 1 or 2, because they are among the most famous things we have. But my old friend, Gary Radke, who organized the exhibit in Atlanta and Detroit, begged me not to include any of the Luca della Robbia Cantoria panels, because he said that would be upstaging our exhibit, and that would basically cut the legs out from under what we'll be doing in Atlanta and Detroit. And originally the third venue of that exhibit was supposed to be the Frick collection in New York, which, when word came out in the New York Times, now about 5 months ago, about the Mobia exhibit that I'm describing to you this evening, withdrew from the agreement. So contracts can be broken in America as well. But if that's reassuring to you, I don't know. No, I was very impressed and mystified. I mean, as if the New York museum-going public could not take 2 very different exhibits, each one with a few of these superlative Luca della Robbia panels. But the director of the Frick, who will be nameless this evening, decided that he would not risk low attendance at his exhibit, since what we'll be doing at Mobia is much fuller than the 3 Luca della Robbia panels that he would have had at the Frick. And so we withdrew. So we'll have all of those, how many are there? 12 million New Yorkers for our exhibit at Mobia. I hope they don't all come at once. The Luca della Robbia Singing Gallery is interesting from many points of view. One is its reclaiming of classical architecture and sculptural forms. It is a genuinely Renaissance work. The micro-architecture with its Roman cornices and fluted pilasters with Corinthian capitals is the first fully antique structure created in Florence in the 15th century. The way it's exhibited in the museum, this is a photograph of how it sat on the wall in the old museum, was the architectural elements with plaster casts of the reliefs at a height which is not the true original one, but which at least obliged the viewer to look up at this and to see it, therefore, in something like its original arrangement, whereas the actual marble reliefs by Luca della Robbia arranged below so that the viewer can enjoy the actual material and stylistic beauty of the original up close. Another of the features that makes the Cantoria interesting is the fact that the subject, which is music, this is a singing gallery, is interpreted through children and young people. This is the first instance in European art of the use of many children carefully studied with bodies and psychological attitudes that are entirely credible. Children were not a big subject in ancient art. They were not an important subject in medieval art. And when they were represented, they almost always looked like miniature adults, wizened gnomes, rather than actual children. Luca della Robbia opens the glorious tradition of Florentine exploration of child physiology and psychology that will carry on through the entire 15th century. That is absolutely fascinating and has been related very convincingly to a uniquely Florentine phenomenon of the period. This is being done in the 1430s, which was the existence of children's confraternities. We know that Florentines were interested in children and adolescents from the point of view of education. And an early 15th century book is actually published on how to educate your children by the Dominican friar Giovanni Dominici, who's very considerably interested in how to educate them religiously. But still, this attempt to help parents understand how you go about molding a child's imagination and therefore character, how you transmit an ethos and a culture to a child, was among the interests of Florentines. A second book on educating children will be published in Florence by Leon Battista Alberti further on in the 15th century. And as I say, there existed, alongside the many confraternities for adult men or women, which were associations that allowed people to come together for prayer, for good works. They usually, these confraternities undertook some kind of charitable work, but they also were involved in culture. Many of the male confraternities staged religious drama, staged religious spectacle. Before modern theater, there was religious theater, mystery plays, so-called, and in Florence, these annual theatrical presentations were done by male confraternities and also by the children's confraternities. So the use of children is very important. It probably also has to do with the fact that in that period and until modern times, in Europe, as in today what is called the Third World, the rate of infant mortality was extremely high. There would be no one in the cathedral for services, and therefore seeing the cantoria, the organ loft singing gallery, who would not have had the direct experience in his/her own family of having lost a child, a little brother, a little sister, a son, a daughter, what have you. And so to see these children raised in their actual original height about 15 meters from the pavement, above the altar of the cathedral, to see them in relation to worship conducted at the high altar of the cathedral, to see them in heaven was certainly moving. To see them joyous and making music in heaven was a way of saying they are with God, they are happy with God, they are enjoying an eternal childhood with God. Because the other interesting thing about the cantoria is that if the children are the interpreters, the actual theme is joy, joy expressed through music, as here another of the panels suggests to you. And it is a very specific joy expressed through music, because you may have noticed that on the, where is it there? No, on the actual architectural frame, you have words. Can you make out the words? They're in beautiful Roman letters. It's the first instance of the recovery of something like Roman times characters, as they're called on our computers, actual Roman lettering. And those are the letters of a psalm. They're the letters, they're the words. They're all of the words of the 150th Psalm, which describes a concert in the temple in Jerusalem. Praise the Lord in the heavens, praise the Lord in the heights, praise him with the sound of trumpets, praise him with drums, praise him with stringed instruments, with organs and harps, and so on. And so it's one of the very few instances in the entire history of major art where an entire literary text is incorporated into the work, and the actual reliefs, the carvings, what makes this an important work of Renaissance sculpture are illustrations of the very words written beneath the panels. Beneath each of the carved panels you have that passage of the psalm that refers to the instruments that you see. There is yet another dimension to this, and it has to do with the heavens, here in another of these reliefs, in which the sculptor Luca dell'Opera found, to his dismay, I'm sure, in itself beautiful diagonal vein in the marble. He would have discovered it only when he got down to that level. It wouldn't have been visible on the outside, or he wouldn't have used the block. But at that point, since the foundation was pressing him to finish, he decided not to ask them to buy a new block and to recut it. He, to the degree possible, incorporated the vein. Certainly it becomes part of the loincloth of the little angel at your child, actually, at your right. I suppose it is an angel. There are little wings there. These are the angels with timbrels. But you'll notice that the three central ones are looking up. They're looking up toward the heavens. And that is because where this work was intended to be put, where it was put for several centuries, in the cathedral, I said, was just beyond the high altar. It was on one of the great pilasters supporting the dome. And the commission of the two singing galleries, the earlier one by Luca dell'Opera, the other one by Donatello, commissioned a year later, was given in 1431 and 1432 respectively, when the dome was being completed. We will in fact take to New York this model made to Brunelleschi's specifications, we believe, of what the dome would look like when Brunelleschi began to build the dome. In the late 14 teens, there was great skepticism that his project would work. People really expected it all to collapse, perhaps killing dozens of workers. By the early 1430s, it had become clear that it was going to hold. He was already 2/3 of the way up the height of the dome, and by God, the thing was not collapsing. And it was at that point that the cathedral authorities said, that means that within a few years the dome will be finished, and we will be able to use the space inside the cathedral beneath the dome, which is now cordoned off because the whole dome area was a building site. We'll be able to use that for religious functions. Among the things we need are new organs and organ lofts. That is why the cantoria were commissioned, and that is why the children are looking up. they're intended to be seen looking with wonder into this man-made heaven, the colossal inner dome of the cathedral, that would be their habitat, that would be where they would be positioned. That really is the reason for the joy and the music making. It was to celebrate the construction of the dome, which was the last structural element of the cathedral, a project which Florence had begun in 1296, would be well and truly finished in all of its structural features by 1436. The commission of the singing galleries in 1431 is preparatory to the joy of the actual completion of the cathedral. While we're talking about that, let me show you a glimpse, again, an architect's rendering of what the gallery within the new museum dedicated to the dome will look like. We'll have those and other 15th century wood models and also a number of newly made, very large, practically habitable models that will allow viewers to understand both the imposing dimensions, even though this is barely a 30th of the actual size of the dome, and more especially the structural features of the dome. That's simply to hype the new museum again. But it was to celebrate the completion of the dome and therefore of the cathedral that the joyous music-making children were created by Luca della Robbia. Here yet another one of these panels. Here one of the two side panels, which is somewhat more directly biographical, because if the children and adolescents on the panels on the front of the singing gallery are imaginary children in heaven, the boys shown on the two side panels are probably actual portraits, or at least somewhat idealized images of the actual singers who would have mounted into those singing galleries at the period, who would have been what today we'd call seminarians. They were boys in the church school next to the cathedral, the Collegio Eugeniano, as it is called, actually created formally by Pope Eugenius IV in the 1430s, but it had existed before that. It was given a new statute by Pope Eugenius. And this was where boys from the age of about 10 could begin training for the priesthood, which at that period really meant, first of all, learning to sing, learning the Latin, learning how to read the Gregorian notes, and then gradually learning the scriptures from which the sung texts had been taken. This remarkable relief, though, of boys of different ages, the youngest one there at your right actually tapping his foot as he sings up a storm, the older ones allowing us to imagine their deep and already resonant baritone or adult tenor voices, as opposed to the voci bianche, the boy tenor voices of the younger ones. That's an actual photograph, as it were, of the boys' choir of the period. Here's the other side relief, equally beautiful, equally biographical in those senses. I wanted to show you these young people because, as I said, the depiction of young people is very important in the early Renaissance in Florence. And if we're not sending the Luca della Robbia panels to New York, we are sending an amazing work by Donatello and an assistant, in which there is the actual first life-size nude that the Renaissance creates. It is an image of the boy Isaac. Here you see a detail. Here you see somewhat more fully Isaac's nude body kneeling in front of the standing figure of his father Abraham, who, if you know the Bible story, believed that God was calling him to make a living sacrifice of his son. And so he takes the boy up onto Mount Moriah, ties him on an altar, and tries to sacrifice the boy, when he is stopped from doing that by an angel sent by God who tells Abraham not to harm the boy, that Abraham should sacrifice rather an animal, a ram that's had got its horns caught in nearby bushes. Here's the entire statue made from one of the niches on the
cathedral bell tower on the campanile begun by Giotto in the 14th century, a larger-than-life statuary group, extremely important in the history of sculpture because it's the first instance of what in the 16th century, what in Michelangelo and other artists will become one of the great compositional schemes, what is later called the figura serpentinata, a sculptural group, 2 or 3 figures composed in a way that you have to look around them, and they each figure somehow contains the other. These figures unfold from each other. Here the marvelous image of the Father standing above the kneeling Son. It is a work of untold drama. Here Donatello has chosen the moment when Abraham hears the angel's voice and learns that he will not have to sacrifice his son. So Donatello shows you Abraham's left hand, which is the one at your right, still tensed as he pulls the boy's hair back to bare the neck in which he intended to plant the knife blow. But Abraham's right hand, in the instant when he hears that he does not have to sacrifice the boy, slides away. It is one of the most spine-chilling analyses of the coordination of mind and heart and body that the early Renaissance achieves. This double action, one hand still believing that the boy is going to be sacrificed, the other hand sliding away from the boy's neck, the knife sliding away, as Abraham himself looks up toward God with unspeakable gratitude written on his features. It is one of the great works of Western art, and we're very happy to be able to send it to New York. Again, these are almost all works that have never traveled. They're in a sense too big. The works of Renaissance sculpture that you typically see in museums outside of Italy are the smaller bits and pieces that were taken off at some point and could easily be sold and transported. Here we're sending the big stuff. I didn't tell you, but the seated evangelists are about 7 feet high seated. These figures are about 6.5 feet high standing. They're larger than 15th century life scale and positively vibrant with feeling, with drama, all of which is intelligible in the context of the biblical stories which they interpret. There are also smaller pieces by Donatello that belong to this same stylistic moment that we're sending. Here's a detail of one of them. And the other big statue from the Bell Tower series that we're sending is the very famous Zuccone, which translated would be in English Pumpkinhead, because he's this magnificently bald figure of an Old Testament prophet. I often tell my students that in biblical and social history, it's a proven fact that the very greatest people were bald. Somehow they don't always believe that. But this amazing work, which probably is meant to illustrate the Ur-Prophet, the father of the tradition of Jewish prophecy, Elijah, even though the work is, I think, mistakenly identified in older sources as Habakkuk. This work is one of the most influential, again, of the early Renaissance major public works that we are happy to be able to send to New York. Donatello was, in some respects, a hyper-realist. He believed that reality ultimately served the purpose of the deep emotional impact he sought to have on viewers. And so he combines vast knowledge of ancient sculpture, certainly the anatomy of this figure, the muscular arm, come from his careful study of Greco-Roman sculpture, and yet this doesn't look like an ancient statue. It looks like a life photo of some impassioned and very powerful figure who, in his niche 20 meters above the pavement, gazes down on the people of Florence and opens his mouth to utter inspired words. All of this is implicit in what Donatello does. Elijah, because if you remember the Bible story, excuse me, I said Elijah, this would be Elisha, Elijah's disciple. As Elijah himself is taken to heaven, he leaves his mantle to Elisha. This is Elisha. And the great mantle, which is part of the overall image, would identify him in that way. In the cleaning of these statues, necessary before inserting them into the museum, we were able to photograph them from behind, where they were never seen. They were set in niches up on the bell tower. No one saw the back, except once, when this statue and several others that Donatello had carved in the 1420s and early 30s for the north side of the bell tower, because those were the niches that remained then to be filled, were moved. They were moved because people said, those are really the most dramatic statues on the whole bell tower, and they're on the north side where they're very hard to see. That's the side that faces the south flank of the cathedral, so they're badly seen on that side. It was decided in 1464, Donatello still being alive, that his statues would be moved to the main front of the bell tower, which means that they were taken down and were seen for a period probably of several weeks in this whole process, which wasn't done in an afternoon. They were seen from behind. And so to be able to study, as will be possible in New York, also the back of the figure, and to see that he really has carved it in the full round. He gives less attention to the back of the figure, but he's thinking of it in the full round, and to know that that same surprise that is carved in the full round must have impacted on those who in 1464 took it down from its original niche prior to putting it in its new and more conspicuous one. My little project that I promised myself to do is to look at everything done after 1464 and see in which works this back view of a contrapposto figure, the figure with one leg engaged and the other one there, the figure's left leg free, is visible. Here, though, another detail of that extraordinary head of the Zuccone, the pumpkin head, the prophet Elisha, excuse me, not Elijah, to give a sense of why this work, from the day it was carved, has struck people as one of the great achievements of Western art. From the day it was carved, shortly after it was carved, our friend Luca della Robbia was asked to do a series of hexagonal reliefs for the bell tower. So he was asked to work in the same place where Donatello was carving this statue. And in one of these hexagonal reliefs, which are part of a series begun in the 14th century on the lower level, Luca della Robbia, who is a very different artistic personality, you've seen him in the sweetness and tenderness of those images of children, clearly tries to capture the passion and the dramatic vitality that Donatello was bringing to his statues in the same years. This is a detail of a relief depicting two philosophers in argument. Vasari calls them Aristotle and Plato, which is probably what 15th century Florentines called them. This is an age which is very conscious of the ancient philosophical tradition. What is wonderful here is that Luca della Robbia shows these men as caught in a moment of intense argument. This is Florence. Florentines argue about everything. If you get in a cab and say, what a lovely day it is today, the driver will immediately say, it was nicer yesterday, or it's going to rain later. You may not have the last word. And this is part of their genius. This is how they produced the Renaissance. They were continually trying to outstrip each other. At all events, that remarkable relief will also be in New York, as will this wonderful image of how young people were educated. That's myself at your left, and there are two of the younger Stanford undergraduates at your right, with their little laptops. No, those are actually books. Those are actually books. It's a marvelous image, though, done in the 1430s, again, of a humanist with his privileged students. This is the way the children of the upper classes learn their letters, and they weren't simply vernacular letters, they were Latin and Greek letters. and Luca della Robbia captures the already clearly classical feeling of the environment in that wonderful Roman door in the background. These works do provide an image of Florentine society, though, which we're happy to bring to New York. In the museum, all of the bell tower statues and reliefs will go into a 90-foot long gallery. There are about 50 reliefs and 16 full-size statues. That gallery is at the second level of the part of the new museum in which the reconstructed facade is located. And as you walk through the gallery and look at the statues there at your right, you can see that the statues are set in front of a wall with openings in it. The openings are those that you see there at your right, at the middle level. As you look at the Donatello statues for the Campanile, you cannot not see the reconstructed facade, because the Campanile statuary was made when the facade statuary was already well advanced. The statues and reliefs for the Campanile were made as part of a program already underway of grand sculptural works for the cathedral facade. To move toward my conclusion, from the parts of the new museum, you then move into the old museum, where in the two rooms with the terracotta pavement here, that until a few months ago were entirely separate rooms, we've now opened a great arch. Moving from the new museum into the old, you'll come into one of two rooms that are meant to evoke the interior of the cathedral. And so, where formerly there was simply a small door between them, now we've removed a great part of the wall so that the viewer actually perceives them as a great and unitary space, albeit articulated in two areas. In the first, we have a series of paintings once in the cathedral. In the space beyond the arch, which is an actual 16th century arch made for the cathedral, in the space beyond is where you actually have the singing galleries. All right, so what I'm doing is giving you a sense of how all of this will not only travel to the States, but will sit in the new museum. That's where you'll see here yet another one, the 10 carved panels by Luca della Robbia. The other singing gallery, the one at your right in this image, is by Donatello. I haven't spoken of that this evening, but those interested will easily find it in books on Renaissance sculpture. We're also sending to New York a beautiful piece of the goldsmith craft that is believed to have been designed by Luca della Robbia, a processional cross that will be in that same room in the museum. What we can't send, and here I come to my conclusion, are the two perhaps most famous works in the museum after the bronze doors of the baptistry, that one of which my students saw this morning at the restoration studio. After the bronze doors, extremely famous is the carved wood statue of the penitent St. Mary Magdalene by Donatello, which in the new museum will have her own gallery. A woman that ugly really should have her own space. No, she's a... what I don't show you in this slide is that despite the physical maceration that we're meant to understand as the result of nights spent in prayer and days spent in fasting, her actual eyes and the gradual coming together of her hands in prayer are oases of deep inner peace. It's an amazing work, a work of Donatello's old age, which I've positioned in the new museum in its own gallery, but right next to an arched opening leading to the next room, which is the room in which we have our very most famous work, the second of Michelangelo's two Pietas. Everyone more or less knows, at least has seen in photograph, the early Pietà in St. Peter's in Rome. Many do not know that in his old age, Michelangelo made an attempt to carve a Pietà between the mid-1540s and the mid-1550s, when he abandoned the work. He actually tried to mutilate it. It is the much larger-than-life statuary group that we will exhibit in a sanctuary-like space that will allow the work to impact upon the viewer with all of the emotional force that Michelangelo tried to give it. It shows the dead Christ being lowered into the arms of Mary, his mother, by one of the two men mentioned in the New Testament as having removed him from the cross. This is not Joseph of Arimathea, the rich man who would also make a tomb available for the burial of Christ. This is the other man, the old man, because the gospel identifies this man, whose name is Nicodemus, as old, a man who had gone by night to Christ to ask how it was possible to be born again. Jesus had used this phrase, and Nicodemus had asked how it was possible for a person to be born again, and Christ explained that this was a spiritual rebirth. What is most interesting and most moving in all of this is that in the figure of Nicodemus, which dominates the composition, which is at the apex of the pyramidal composition, which is right above the figure of the dead Christ. In the figure of Nicodemus, Michelangelo portrayed himself. This is the practically 80-year-old Michelangelo, who in fact was carving this for himself, for his own tomb. Ultimately, he became impatient, I believe, with his own inability to finish it as he wanted. He's an old man. He was not really able to do the work he had done as a young man. He even tells us in a poem of the same years that somehow art no longer grips his imagination as it once had done. His mind is focused on God, on Christ. He is preparing for death. He is preparing for the next world. And yet here he portrays himself with an expression of infinite inwardness, holding the dead Christ. This we cannot take to New York. For this, they and you will have to come to the new museum, which we expect to open on the 29th of October. I'll expect you in the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. As usual, this was quite something. So we'll open it up for a couple of questions. I think Professor Verdon will not take more than one or two.
Yes.
When you design a museum with a couple of rooms building one or two pieces, how do you decide between the trade-off of adding more pieces to the museum and just exhibiting them solely?
Well, that's a very basic choice, because the things you put into a space are going to obviously color the way in which the visitor to the space perceives those very things. If there's only one thing in a room, the visitor has to look at that. The visitor immediately understands that must be very important. Obviously, if you go that way, you have to choose something that is so powerful that it can sustain the focused attention of many people in a space of considerable size. That's absolutely true of the Michelangelo Pietà, which I wanted to keep isolated for another reason. As I said, he carved it for his own tomb, which means that it was never intended to be part of the Florence Cathedral Museum. Almost everything else in the museum is something made at one point in time for one of the buildings of the cathedral complex, the cathedral, the baptistry, the bell tower. This is not. This was carved in Rome, where he lived his last years. He intended it to go in the chapel in which he thought he would be buried, which was probably going to be in the Roman church of Santa Maria Maggiore. And so it didn't pass his mind that this would ever come to Florence, nor can it really be put side by side with things made for the cathedral. It has to have its own space. And so for those reasons we isolated. It came to Florence because after his death no one respected his wishes. He wanted to be buried in Rome. The Grand Duke of Tuscany wanted this famous Florentine brought back to Florence, which was done. He was given a state funeral in Santa Croce. The principal artists of the period were asked to create a monumental tomb for him in Santa Croce, Giorgio Vasari and his assistants, within which tomb I believe that Michelangelo to this day is writhing
with distaste, because it's the weakest possible derivative version of his own sculpture. This work, which he had abandoned, beginning to carve another work, which is now in Milan, the so-called Rondinini Pietà, he had also tried to mutilate. He'd then given the pieces to a servant who sold them to a collector. The work was put back together and was finally brought to Florence in the 17th century. Was put into the crypt of San Lorenzo, which was a church of the Medici family. The Grand Dukes were of the Medici family still in 1671 through 4, when the statue was brought by sea to Florence, from Civitavecchia to Livorno, and then brought on the Arno on a great barge. This is several tons of very delicate marble. And it was finally brought into the cathedral only in 1722. I remember the day well. It was put behind the high altar, and then in the 20th century it was moved to another position in the cathedral, and then in 1980, because it caused too much trouble in the cathedral. People came in simply to see this, they interrupted Mass and so on to go and photograph so it was decided to move it to the museum in 1980, and now it has to be taken down from the room where it is presently. It has to be taken down about 20 steps and moved into that room that I showed you in the virtual rendering. And they tell me they know how to do that. I hope it's true. Other questions?
One more question? Yes. This will be the final question.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I came in a few minutes late, so I didn't hear.
We can't hear you.
Is this the original Pietà of Michelangelo that's going to New York?
The Pietà is not going to New York. I was doing several things in this lecture. One was illustrating the works that either are already in America, several of the Luca della Robbia Cantoria panels, or that will go for the New York show, opening February 20th, and those are the Donatello, Nanni di Banco, and some other Luca della Robbia works. But I also tried to situate our ability to lend these works for exhibits in New York within the context of our having a museum that is closed, as it is being completely enlarged and redone. And so I was also, in this evening's talk, illustrating how the works will be arranged in the new museum. The Pietà, which I wanted to end with, because you can't beat Michelangelo, will not travel. It has to go down those 20 steps into its new room, but it won't go any further than that.
Thank you so much. Grazie.